The bar wasn't loud that night. No music shaking the walls. No shouting over pool tables. Just low conversations, soft amber lighting, and the quiet clink of glasses. Then the door opened. A few heads turned, not because someone famous walked in, but because the room felt the shift. In stepped Keanu Reeves. No entourage, no security, no dramatic entrance, dark jacket, simple boots, calm expression. He didn't scan the room for attention, didn't wait to be noticed. He just walked to the bar, nodded politely, and took a seat in the corner. Most people went back to their drinks, but not everyone. Across the room sat a group of bikers, leather vests, heavy boots, loud laughter that carried too far. They weren't causing trouble, just owning the space the way confident groups sometimes do. One of them noticed him first. A pause, a squint, then a smirk. Another biker leaned back in his chair to look. "Is that?" they whispered. Then they chuckled. It wasn't admiration. It was curiosity mixed with something else. The urge to test the quiet guy in the corner. A few minutes later, they stood up. Not aggressively. Not rushing, just slowly drifting closer, until drifting turned into circling. One pulled a chair near his table, another stood just behind him, not touching, not threatening, just close enough to make it clear. You're not alone anymore. The conversations in the bar softened. People pretended not to stare, and through it all, Keanu didn't react. He took a sip of his drink, set the glass down gently, looked up, not startled, not annoyed, just present. One biker leaned forward slightly. "Didn't expect to see you somewhere like this." It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. The air tightened. Most people in that position would shift uncomfortably, defend themselves, or stand up too fast. He didn't. Instead, he adjusted his chair just an inch, enough to create space without making it obvious. Small movement, big message. The bikers exchanged a glance. Something about his stillness unsettled, the rhythm they were trying to control. Because the moment they surrounded him, they expected tension. They expected ego. They expected reaction. What they didn't expect was calm. And that's when the atmosphere truly changed. Before this moment turns into something exaggerated, let's ground it. This wasn't a movie scene. No hidden cameras. No scripted confrontation. It was simply a social situation. The kind that can happen anywhere when strong personalities share the same space. The bikers weren't villains. They weren't criminals looking for trouble. They were confident, loud, used to being the most dominant presence in whatever room they walked into. In groups, energy amplifies. Laughter gets louder. Movements get bigger. Space feels smaller for anyone outside the circle. And then there was Keanu Reeves. Public perception often blurs reality. People see the roles, the intense stare, the precision movement, the calculated calm, especially from films like John Wick. They assume the actor and the character are the same. But real life doesn't work like that. Yes, Keanu trained extensively for his action roles. Long hours of disciplined preparation, controlled sparring, technical repetition, focus on timing and awareness rather than brute force. But training doesn't automatically mean confrontation, and discipline doesn't equal aggression. That's what made this situation interesting. The bikers weren't reacting to a martial artist. They were reacting to a quiet man who didn't seem impressed by their presence. In social psychology, there's something called status testing. It happens subconsciously. When a group senses someone who doesn't submit to the room's unspoken hierarchy, they apply pressure. Not always physically, often verbally, spatially, energetically. That's what this was. A test. Would he shrink? Would he overreact? Would he try to prove something? Instead, he did something different. He remained neutral. Not cold, not defensive. Neutral. That neutrality can be confusing to people who are used to visible reactions, because confidence often feeds on response. Laughter feeds on attention. Dominance feeds on visible discomfort. but when there's no discomfort to amplify. The rhythm breaks. Observers later described the moment not as explosive, but as strange. The bikers weren't shouting. They weren't threatening. They were trying to establish presence, yet somehow the smaller table in the corner began to feel steadier. Keanu didn't raise his voice, didn't drop any clever one-liners, didn't posture. He simply stayed grounded. There's a difference between physical strength and composure under pressure. Physical strength is visible. Composure is subtle. And subtle strength often shifts dynamics without anyone fully understanding why. One biker tried humor. Another tried mild teasing. Still, no reaction beyond polite acknowledgement. That's when things became less about intimidation and more about confusion. Because if someone isn't reacting the way you expect, you start reassessing your approach. This wasn't a showdown, it wasn't a prelude to violence, it was a psychological pivot point, the kind that doesn't go viral because of chaos, but because of control. And here's what most viewers misunderstand. The power in the room didn't shift because someone was stronger. It shifted because someone wasn't emotionally available to be provoked. That difference matters. The circle tightened, not aggressively, but deliberately. One biker pulled a chair closer, the legs scraping lightly against the wooden floor. Another rested his hands on the back of Keanu's chair. Not grabbing, not pushing. Just close enough to signal presence. It wasn't about violence, it was about pressure. The kind that builds slowly and tests how steady someone really is. Across the room, conversations dimmed. A bartender paused mid-polish, a couple near the window, pretended to look at their phones but kept glancing up. Energy travels fast in closed spaces, and everyone could feel it. The lead biker leaned forward slightly. "You're pretty calm," he said, almost amused. It wasn't a compliment, it was a probe. Still seated, Keanu Reeves looked up, meeting his eyes without challenge. No smirk, no tension in his jaw, just steady awareness. There's a difference between staring someone down and simply not looking away. He chose the second. That subtle distinction mattered, because when someone stares aggressively, it escalates. When someone looks calmly, it stabilizes. The support biker shifted his weight, another chimed in with a joke, light enough to pass as humor, sharp enough to test pride. A few quiet chuckles followed. They were waiting for the flinch, the defensive comment, the irritated sigh, anything to confirm they had control of the moment. Instead, Keanu adjusted his glass slightly, creating a bit more space on the table. A small movement, but intentional. It signaled awareness without submission. People often underestimate how powerful controlled body language can be. No crossed arms, no clenched fists, no tightening posture, just relaxed shoulders and steady breathing. One of the bikers tried stepping slightly closer, invading personal space just enough to see if boundaries would be asserted. That's when something shifted. Keanu didn't move back, but he didn't move forward either. He simply straightened his posture. Not confrontational. Grounded. It's difficult to intimidate someone who doesn't shrink, and it's equally difficult to escalate someone who doesn't rise to bait. The tension didn't explode. It stretched, like a rope pulled tight from both ends. The bikers weren't used to this dynamic. They were used to reactions, loud reactions, nervous reactions, aggressive reactions. Silence forced them to recalibrate. The leader tried again, this time softer. "You don't seem bothered." The statement lingered in the air. Keanu's response was measured and quiet, calm enough that only those closest could hear. "Why would I be?" No sarcasm, no challenge, just a question returned. And that's when observers noticed the first real hesitation. Not fear, hesitation. Because the usual rhythm, dominance followed by submission, wasn't playing out. The room wasn't witnessing a confrontation. It was witnessing a stalemate of energy, and stalemates are uncomfortable for people who expect control. The bikers exchanged brief glances. The momentum they tried to build wasn't landing. Not because they were overpowered, but because they weren't being engaged in the way they anticipated. Tension doesn't always rise through shouting. Sometimes it rises through stillness, and in that moment, the quiet man in the corner wasn't escalating, but he wasn't yielding either. Up to this point, the tension had been subtle, measured, almost quiet. But tension, even when controlled, has weight, and eventually, something has to give. One of the bikers, younger, more restless than the others, stepped half a pace forward. Not aggressively, just enough to close the final inch of space. It was the closest anyone had come. The room felt smaller. Glasses stopped clinking. The bartender stopped moving. Even the low background music suddenly felt distant. Moments like this usually tip one of two ways: escalation or retreat. Instead, something unexpected happened. Keanu Reeves slowly stood up. Not abruptly, not knocking the chair back, just a smooth, controlled movement to his feet. Now they were eye level. That alone shifted the energy. When someone remains seated, they appear passive. When they stand too fast, they appear reactive. But standing calmly? That signals readiness without aggression. The younger biker seemed surprised, not because of size or intimidation, but because the move was balanced. No clenched fists, no squared shoulders, just posture, grounded posture. The lead biker watched closely. He expected one of two reactions: a challenge or a defensive excuse. Instead, Keanu adjusted his jacket slightly and spoke in a low, even tone. "I'm just here to enjoy a quiet drink." No threat hidden in the words, no sarcasm layered underneath, just a boundary. Clear, calm, direct. Boundaries delivered without emotion are difficult to push against because there's nothing to grab onto. The younger biker tried to laugh it off. "Relax, we're just talking." And that was the key moment. The tension could have spiked. It could have turned into shoving. It could have become the kind of clip that spreads online with dramatic headlines. But it didn't. Keanu nodded once. "I understand. Short, neutral." Then he added something that subtly changed everything. "Let's keep it that way. Not a warning, not a dare, just a statement of mutual respect." That's when the dynamic truly flipped, because up until now, the bikers believed they were applying pressure. But suddenly, they were being offered something unexpected: dignity. They weren't being challenged. They weren't being insulted. They weren't being embarrassed in front of the room. They were being given a choice. And psychologically, that's powerful. When someone escalates, it forces confrontation. When someone offers calm clarity, it forces self-awareness. The lead biker looked around briefly. He could feel the room watching. If he pushed further, it wouldn't feel dominant anymore. It would feel unnecessary. There's a thin line between confidence and insecurity, and the difference often shows when someone else refuses to play the game. The younger biker took half a step back. Small movement. Big, meaning. The circle loosened slightly. No one announced it. No one admitted it. But the shift was visible. The pressure they had tried to create wasn't landing, not because they were outmatched physically, but because there was no emotional reaction to feed off. Real composure has gravity. It pulls chaos into stillness. Keanu didn't hold eye contact aggressively. He didn't smirk. He didn't perform for the room. He simply waited. And sometimes waiting is the strongest position in a tense moment. After a few seconds, which felt longer than they were, the lead biker gave a half nod. Fair enough. 2 words, but they carried the release of pressure. The younger biker stepped aside. Another returned to his seat. The circle dissolved as quietly as it formed, and just like that, the room began breathing again. No dramatic applause, no cheering, no triumphant exit music, just space restored. Keanu sat back down calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip. The message wasn't dominance, it wasn't victory, it was control. And that's what made it powerful. Because strength that doesn't need to explode often feels stronger than strength that does. The bikers hadn't been defeated. They hadn't been embarrassed, but they had miscalculated. They expected emotion. They met composure. They expected reaction. They met restraint. And in that quiet recalibration, the atmosphere permanently changed. By the next morning, the story had already changed. Someone at the bar posted a vague comment online. Crazy moment last night. Bikers tried testing Keanu Reeves. Didn't go how they expected. That was enough. Within hours, speculation filled in the blanks. He knocked someone out. They backed down because they knew who he was. It almost turned violent. He went full John Wick. None of it was true. What actually happened was far less dramatic and far more interesting. There were no punches, no shattered bottles, no threats shouted across the room. Just tension that dissolved. But the internet struggles with quiet endings. In films like John Wick, conflict builds toward explosive release. Audiences are trained to expect retaliation, escalation, a decisive final move. So when people heard that Keanu Reeves had been cornered, they mentally filled in the rest. Because narrative habits are powerful, we assume confrontation leads to action. We assume dominance must be proven physically. We assume someone must win. But what if that assumption is the real misunderstanding? The bikers didn't leave ashamed. They didn't storm out, embarrassed. They simply recalibrated. After the tension eased, a few returned to their original table. A couple even resumed casual conversation. The bar slowly returned to its earlier rhythm. From a distance, it looked like nothing had happened, and that's the part that confused people. One observer later described it perfectly. It wasn't dramatic. It was just controlled. That word matters. Controlled. There's a misconception that control means suppression, that someone must be holding something back explosively. But real control isn't tight, it's relaxed. Keanu didn't appear tense during the exchange. He didn't look like someone containing anger. He looked like someone who didn't feel threatened in the first place. That difference shifts everything, because intimidation only works when it finds insecurity. If someone isn't insecure in that moment, pressure loses its leverage. Online, though, nuance disappears. Clips get shortened. Headlines get sharpened. Moments get exaggerated. Suddenly, a calm boundary becomes a standoff. A quiet nod becomes a warning. A step back becomes instant regret. But here's what regret actually looked like that night. Not fear, not panic. Recognition. The bikers recognized that pushing further would serve no purpose. They weren't facing aggression, they were facing stillness. And stillness doesn't give you momentum to fight against. There's something psychologically disarming about someone who refuses to compete for dominance. When someone doesn't try to win the room often gravitates toward them anyway. That's what happened. Not because Keanu asserted himself loudly, but because he didn't need to. Observers noticed that he never referenced his training, never referenced his films, never leaned into reputation. He didn't weaponize identity, and that removed the ego layer entirely. The internet, however, thrives on ego narratives. Hero versus villain, winner versus loser, alpha versus challenger. But this situation didn't fit those templates. There was no humiliation. No one was put in their place. No dramatic speech about respect, just an adult moment handled calmly. That's harder to package into a viral highlight. Yet ironically, that's why it spread. Because in a culture saturated with clips of chaos, a story about de-escalation feels rare. People weren't sharing it because it was violent. They were sharing it because it wasn't. That contrast stood out, and perhaps the biggest misunderstanding of all? People assumed the bikers instantly regretted it because they were physically intimidated. But regret isn't always about fear. Sometimes regret is realizing you misread someone. Misread their energy. Misread their temperament. Misread their stability. They expected friction. They found composure. They expected ego. They found boundaries. They expected reaction. They found presence. That mismatch created the shift, not strength, not speed, not threat, presence, and, here's something rarely discussed. De-escalation requires more strength than escalation. Anyone can react. Anyone can raise their voice. Anyone can turn tension into chaos. But holding steady under social pressure, that's discipline, that's internal control. By the end of the night, there was no dramatic conclusion. Keanu finished his drink, paid quietly, nodded politely to the bartender, and left. No one followed him outside, no final confrontation, just a door closing softly behind him. Meanwhile, the bikers stayed. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quieter than before. The story that spread online wanted a cinematic ending. What it got instead was something more subtle, and arguably more powerful. Reminder that the strongest move in a tense moment is sometimes choosing not to make one. After the door closed behind Keanu Reeves, the story should have ended. But the real lesson didn't happen in the bar. It happened in reflection. Because moments like that aren't about who stood taller. They're about who stayed centered. Fictional. Bikers weren't dangerous men looking for violence. They were reacting to energy, testing it. And when that energy didn't crack, they adjusted. That adjustment is important. It proves something most people overlook. Tension doesn't always need to explode to be resolved. Sometimes it just needs maturity. In high-pressure social situations, people instinctively fall into roles. The imam, aggressor, the challenger, the silent observer, the reactive defender. But what happens when someone refuses to play any of those roles? That's what shifted the atmosphere that night. Keanu didn't posture. He didn't shrink. He didn't dominate. He stayed neutral. And neutrality, when combined with confidence, is incredibly disarming. Most confrontations escalate because both sides feed off each other's emotion. Tone rises. Body language hardens. Pride activates. But remove ego from one side, and the equation collapses. There's a reason martial arts training, even for actors preparing for roles like John Wick, emphasizes control over aggression, discipline over impulse, breathing over reaction. Because real strength isn't about how fast you strike. It's about how slowly you respond. The bikers may not have consciously analyzed what happened, but they felt it. They felt that pushing further would no longer be about playful dominance. It would cross into unnecessary territory, and when someone across from you isn't escalating, escalation starts to feel irrational. That's when maturity quietly wins. There's something powerful about emotional regulation in public spaces. It communicates. I don't need to overpower you to feel secure. That security is magnetic. It steadies rooms. It resets conversations. It lowers tension without anyone announcing it. And here's the deeper truth. Most people think regret comes from fear. But often, regret comes from realization. Realization that you misjudged someone. Realization that your assumptions were shallow. Realization that the person you tried to pressure didn't need to prove anything. That kind of realization lingers. Not as embarrassment, but as perspective. In today's culture, confrontation is often celebrated. Clips of arguments, viral fights, dramatic wins. But quiet composure rarely trends, and yet it's the skill that actually improves lives. Think about it. How many arguments spiral simply because no one chooses calm first? How many tensions escalate because someone feels the need to defend pride? Instantly, what happened in that bar wasn't cinematic. It wasn't explosive. It was restrained, and restraint is underrated. Restraint requires self-awareness. It requires knowing your capabilities and not needing to display them. That's a subtle but important difference, because insecurity seeks validation through action. Security doesn't. By the end of the night, nothing physical had happened, but something psychological had. The energy hierarchy in the room shifted, not because someone claimed dominance, but because someone demonstrated stability. And stability is contagious. Even the bikers, after returning, to their table were noticeably quieter, not defeated, just reflective. Moments like that don't create enemies, they create recalibration. They remind everyone watching that power doesn't always roar, sometimes it barely speaks. There's also another layer to consider. Public figures are often expected to react dramatically, to embody the personas audiences project onto them. But real maturity is separating character from identity. The world might associate Keanu with relentless action scenes and precision combat, but that night, what stood out wasn't combat skill, it was composure. And composure is harder to fake than aggression. Aggression can be performed. Composure must be practiced. That's the real lesson. Not that someone won, not that someone was intimidated, but that calm boundaries, delivered clearly, can dissolve tension faster than force ever could. When the story circulated online, people focused on the title. They instantly regretted it. But the regret wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. The regret of underestimating someone's steadiness. The regret of assuming noise equals power. And perhaps the most valuable takeaway? Control is quiet, and the quietest person in the room may be the one most in control of themselves. By the time the night fully settled, the bar had returned to normal. Glasses clinked again. Music resumed its soft rhythm. Conversations restarted as if nothing unusual had happened, and in many ways, nothing had. There was no fight, no dramatic showdown, no viral clip of chaos. Yet somehow, the story carried further than louder incidents ever do. Why? Because people expected one ending and got another. When word spread that Keanu Reeves had been cornered by bikers, imaginations immediately filled in explosive details. They pictured something straight out of John Wick, fast reactions. Perfect counters. A clear display of dominance. But what unfolded that night didn't match cinematic expectation. It matched something rarer, emotional intelligence. That's why the phrase, "they instantly regretted it," became attached to the story. Not because someone was physically overpowered, but because the dynamic shifted in a way no one predicted. The bikers approached expecting a reaction. Maybe defensiveness. Maybe irritation. Maybe ego. Instead, they encountered composure, and composure changes power structures quietly. When someone refuses to react emotionally, the energy has nowhere to go. It can't bounce. It can't escalate. It simply dissipates. That's what happened. The regret wasn't loud. It wasn't visible embarrassment. It was subtle recalibration. The moment someone realizes, this isn't the situation I thought it was. There's strength in physical ability, but there's deeper strength in emotional regulation. In modern culture, confrontation is often glorified. Winning arguments, dominating rooms, having the last word. But true maturity often looks less impressive in the moment. It looks like restraint, and restraint doesn't trend as easily as conflict. Yet ironically, this story traveled precisely because it broke that pattern. In a world saturated with viral fights and heated exchanges, a calm boundary feels refreshing. It reminds people that not every tense moment needs escalation. Not every test needs retaliation. Not every challenge needs to be accepted. The bikers walked away without humiliation. That matters. No one was shamed. No one was exposed. No one lost face publicly. Because humiliation creates enemies. Respect creates reflection. And reflection lingers longer than fear ever does. There's also something important about identity here. Public figures are often boxed into the characters they portray. Many people see Keanu and instantly think of controlled violence from his films. But that night wasn't about action choreography, it was about real-world presence. And real-world presence doesn't rely on spectacle, it relies on steadiness. Steadiness under social pressure is rare. Most people, when surrounded or tested, feel adrenaline spike. Heart rate rises, voice tightens, posture stiffens, But when someone remains measured, it shifts the psychological landscape. It communicates, "I am not threatened," and that quiet signal is powerful, because intimidation only works when it finds fear. Without fear, pressure loses purpose. That's why the situation dissolved rather than exploded. No one needed to win. No one needed to dominate. The energy simply corrected itself. And maybe that's the bigger message this story carries. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it barely moves. In fact, the strongest move that night wasn't standing up. It wasn't speaking calmly, it wasn't holding eye contact, it was refusing to let ego enter the equation. Ego demands reaction. Ego demands validation. Ego demands visible proof of superiority, but confidence doesn't. Confidence is quiet. It doesn't need witnesses, it doesn't need applause, it doesn't need headlines. It simply holds its ground and lets the moment pass. That's why the title resonates. They instantly regretted it. Because what they likely regretted wasn't approaching him. It was misreading the situation, misjudging the temperament, assuming stillness meant weakness. In reality, stillness can be the clearest signal of strength. The bar returned to normal. The bikers finished their drinks. Life moved forward. No grudges formed. No dramatic aftermath followed. Just a small shift in perspective for everyone who witnessed it. And perhaps that's what made it viral in a different way. It reminded people that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it barely speaks. In a culture addicted to loud victories, this was a quiet one. Not a victory over others, but a victory over impulse, over ego, over unnecessary escalation. And that kind of victory rarely trends, yet it shapes character far more deeply. So when you hear the phrase, "they instantly regretted," don't picture chaos, picture recalibration. Picture a moment where tension met steadiness, and steadiness prevailed. Because at the highest level of maturity, the goal isn't to defeat others, it's to master yourself.